So our format today, I'm John Daly. I used to be Miriam's oldest son, but then we took a vote and now I'm the youngest son. And isn't it wonderful how democracy works? Since this is Mother's Day, it seemed appropriate to bring my mother here, and Jim has so graciously invited us to come talk. And of course we're here to talk about her new book, Dr. Miriam, which is about her life. And we'll begin with a question, Mom. Can you tell everybody what caused you to start writing your stories?
Well, part of the book tells about the trip we took to Alaska in 1965, and I just wrote that as a log of our trip. But fortunately, I kept it. And then, when I was still living here in Albion, they had what they called AALL classes, and they had one on creative writing. So I started writing stories there. And then when I moved to Chelsea, I joined the creative writing class there. And I'm still writing stories. So my newest stories are not in the book because I've written them since the book was published. So,
I discovered a year and a half ago she had 52 of these stories. And that began the process of editing these into the book. But they didn't all get in. For example, there were a bunch of stories about her mother, which, since her mother had also written extensively, we'll edit those into a volume as well, both my mother's stories and her mother's stories. But can you tell us a little bit about your mother, since it's Mother's Day? How did she become a doctor?
well, my grandmother was in real estate, and she owned a lot of houses. She also owned what are called ground rents. That is the land under the house, but not the house. And of course, somebody had to collect the rent. So that was my job when I was 17 years old, to help collect the rent.
You mean that was your mother's job?
My mother. I'm getting mothers confused. So, yeah. So this one lady who rented a house was named Dr. Jenny Brown. And she and my mother got well acquainted because my mother had to come once a month and collect the rent. You know, what you're going to do when the rent comes around. So Dr. Jenny Brown said to my mother, what are you going to do with your life? And my mother was 17 years old, and she said, oh, I don't know, I like to draw, maybe I'll become an artist. And this lady said, well, why don't you become a doctor? She said, you're young, you're good looking, and you're tall, and I think you'd make a good doctor. So she said, why don't you apply to medical school? So my mother went home and told her mother that they thought she ought to go to medical school. And my grandmother said, well, I always wanted one of my children to go to medical school, so it might as well be you. So she did. Hey there, look who's back there.
And where did she go to medical school?
It was a women's medical college in Baltimore, which no longer exists.
So, tell us where you grew up.
Where I grew up in Baltimore.
And what was the house like?
Well, it was a big duplex house, you know, with a wall right down the middle of it. And we lived on one side, on the first and second floors. And then my parents, who were both doctors, had their office on the first floor, on the other side, and rented out the rest of it.
So you're saying their medical office was in their home?
Yes, it was a duplex house. So they lived on one side and the office was
today is not just Mother's Day, but it's also VE Day, standing for Victory in Europe. So today there's some people thinking about the end of World War II. Do you remember where you were when you learned about Pearl Harbor being attacked?
Let's see. I think I was in Michigan. I was on.
No, you would have been in Maryland, December 7th, 1941.
I'm trying to think where I was.
You were visiting your aunt. Tell us about visit to your aunt.
We had a farm in Maryland. We used to go there every Sunday, just tramp around the farm. And then on the way home, I stopped to see my Aunt Pearl, who lived in Hampstead, which was the closest town. And she told us about Pearl Harbor.
And when the war ended, VJ Day, you were in Michigan for VJ Day. Where in Michigan were you for VJ Day?
That was when I was at Camp Grace Bentley, which is north of Port Huron. And it was a crippled children's camp, and I was a counselor.
So how did you learn that the war was over?
I don't know, but
Well,
I must have been the radio. I don't think we had TV then.
I recall you saying that there were people honking cars out on the road.
They were driving past the camp, honking cor, the war is over, the war is over. And so the camp director said, what should we do? We're so grateful the war is over. So they decided to have a chapel service. And thank God the war was over, and I remember that. I thought that was a very appropriate thing to do, because we had been, Hitler had been trouncing around Europe, and then finally we got into the war, and it was so good that it was over. That was such a relief, I remember.
So the war ends, and as the war ends, you enter medical school. What kind of people were in medical school with you that very first semester? What kind of people were able to go to medical school right after the war?
Well, a lot of the people in my med school class were veterans, because they had the GI Bill, which paid for education. And I think there were about 12 women in the class, 10 or 12 women out of 80 students. So it was predominantly men, but there were at least 10 of us women in the class.
Are you saying there was a quota for women?
Yeah, they had quotas for women. They also had quotas for Jewish people, believe it or not. That would not be very acceptable today, either one.
And there was someone you knew who was at Pearl Harbor when it got bombed. Who was that?
Well, I had an adopted brother who was stationed, he was in the Navy when Pearl Harbor was bombed. But he was in the hospital because he had stomach trouble. They were taking x-rays to find out whether he had an ulcer or not. So all the able-bodied men were put to work carrying stretchers for the people that were wounded at Pearl Harbor. So that was what he did that day.
So, how much older than you was Donald?
Quite a bit. 10 or 15 years.
Tell us the story about Hazel and Donald. How did they become part of your family?
Well, my mother became a doctor. And she got a job at the juvenile court in Baltimore doing physicals on the children that came through, the orphans and the, whatever, juvenile delinquents and people like that. cutest little girl today. I saw the cutest little boy today. Well, my grandmother thought she's going to want to have children of her own. And, and if you got married in those days, usually women had to quit working. So my grandmother said, why don't you bring one of these children home? So she brought home a little boy who was adopted, and she brought home a little girl that was adopted. And then there was a third child who came to live with my grandmother who was not adopted.
And do I recall that Alan was homeless?
And he was a waif on the street, and my grandmother took him in, let him live with her.
So your mother had 3 children living in her household before she got married.
Yes.
And she lived with her parents. So she
Yeah.
lived with her parents, these 3 children, and your mother.
Yeah.
And how old was she when she married our grandfather?
How old was my mother?
When she married your father?
She was 35.
Was that a good age to get married?
No. But she had me when she was 38, and then my sister when she was 40, and then my brother when she was 42. And then nature ran out on her and she didn't have any more children.
And because your mother was so old when she had you, you made a decision when you were a teenager. What was that decision?
Well, I thought my grandmother was 23 when she got married. And that sounded to me like a good age to get married. So I said, I'm going to get married when I'm 23.
So January 26, 1948 arrives. It's your 23rd birthday. What's going through your mind that day?
Well, I said, this is the year I'm going to get married. I wonder who I'm going to marry. Didn't have any prospects.
No prospects whatsoever.
No.
There weren't any men in your medical school?
Well, but most of them were married. A lot of them were older and veterans. And
So they had divided your medical school up into 2 sections. There was A through M, and there was M through Z. And you were Miriam Chambers, so you were in the
Yes.
you were in the S's.
right.
And then they mixed up the classes. Did that do anything?
Well, yes. One day, I happened to be doing some sort of a lab experiment next to a man named Harold Daly. And I knew his name, but I really didn't know him. But I thought I ought to be friendly. So I said hello. And we were going to have a dance that Saturday. I already had a date. But I said, are you going to the dance Saturday? And he said, no. And I said, well, what's wrong? Can't you find a babysitter? And he said, I'm not married. Then I thought, oh my gosh, I said the wrong thing. But somehow, when I went to go home that night to get on the streetcar, there he was standing on the same spot. So next thing I knew, he was driving me to school. And I think we had our first date on March the 28th. And we got married on June the 28th. Long courtship, 3 months.
It is not clear whether they were engaged before or after this first date. According to my father, he was driving her to school one day, and she said, I think I know how we can get married. My father said, I almost hit a bus.
But we did.
Tell us about your wedding.
I got married.
Well,
Let's see.
what caused you to choose June 28th?
Oh, well, there was a girl named Louise Rolls who lived with us. She was my sister's roommate, and she was getting married on June the 26th. which was Saturday. So she had been planning her wedding for a whole year. So I thought, well, I can't get married before she does. I don't want to, rain on her parade. So I said, well, I'll get married on June the 28th, which was Monday. And nobody ever gets married on Monday. But that didn't seem to occur to me, that people didn't get married on Monday. So I got married on Monday.
So, did you and Louise, and the reason Louise was living with my grandparents was her parents had both died. So they took in yet another child. And tell us about shopping for wedding dresses with Louise.
Oh, well, we needed something to wear at our weddings. So we went downtown to the department store, and we went to the bridal shop, and all the dresses were at least $100. I never spent $100 for a dress. The most I ever spent for a dress was about $14. So I went down to the bargain basement, and I found a very nice dress for $17. It was pale blue, and it was short, just below the knee. And I bought that, and that's what I got married in. Well, my country cousins, when they saw me not wearing a long white dress, were sure I must be pregnant. So they started asking my mother when the baby was due. Well, it took this baby 4.5 years to get there.
So, let's tell a medical story. Where did you do your internship?
At Lutheran Hospital of Maryland in Baltimore.
And tell us about the man that came in with having been in a bad car accident.
Oh, this man came in, we used to have to take turns working in the emergency room. This man came in with blood all over his face. And he said, I can't see. Well, I took one look at him, took a hold of his scalp, pulled it back up like this. He said, oh, I see fine now. So then I had to stitch up the laceration, which went from ear to ear. So we usually, I could have done it all by myself, but usually we get one of the young doctors who had just gone into practice who needed the money. So I called one of these young doctors to come in, and he wasn't feeling well. He had sort of an intestinal flu, but he needed the money, so he came in. So he said, well, this is a long laceration. Why don't you start at one end, and I'll start at the other end. And we put individual stitches in, and then we'll bead in the middle. Well, we started stitching, and next thing I knew, this doctor fainted on the floor. The nurse was off somewhere else. So there I am, and I had sterile gloves on, so I couldn't help this doctor. So I just left him lying on the floor, sort of half-conscious. So I kept sewing. And by the time the doctor woke up, I had finished the whole laceration all the way across the top of his head. But he was able to sign the emergency room records and send a bill for doing the suturing and put me down as his assistant because I wasn't going to get paid for the thing.
Did you get to put the doctor down as one of your patients?
What do you mean?
Well, he was on the floor. He needed to be revived.
Well, this doctor, the doctor that fainted, he signed the papers as the surgeon, although he'd been unconscious on the floor a good bit of the time. put me down as his assistant. So,
Tell us how you came to Albion.
oh, gee, that's a long time. Well, after this was in Maryland, we're in Baltimore. And the city changed a lot after World War II. And we decided we wanted to get out of the city. So we began thinking about where would we like to practice. Well, I had been to Michigan as a camp counselor at the Crippled Children's Camp, and my sister had moved to Michigan, and we had gone fishing on Fife Lake in Michigan. And so we said, well, let's look around and see if we can't find a town in Michigan. So we wrote to the Michigan Health Council, told them who we were, and they recommended 15 different towns. And our hospital administrator said, write to the hospital administrators and see if they would need 2 doctors. My husband was a surgeon, and I was a family physician, but mostly did pediatrics. So we wrote to these 15 hospital administrators, and we got 13 negative replies. Now that's almost unbelievable. But some of the hospital administrators said, well, half the doctors aren't speaking to the other half, or that we have a surgeon and we don't need another one, and so forth and so on. But there were 2 hospitals that said they would like us to come. One was Albion, and one was Greenville. Well, we took a trip out here, checked out Albion, checked out Greenville, and we liked both towns, and we couldn't decide which town we wanted to come to. So we needed to make a decision. So we made another trip out here. We visited Greenville, and we said, this is a nice town. Maybe we'll come here. But I said, I have a feeling we ought to go check out Albion before we decide on Greenville. And as I drove down Michigan Avenue, past whatever this was, junior high school, whatever it was, it just came over me. This is the town. And so we never went back to Greenville. And we came to Albion, practiced here for, I think it was something like 41 years before we moved to Chelsea, which is where I live now. But I'm long retired.
Reading the correspondence they had with these hospitals back in that era, one of the concerns seemed to be that they were medical specialists at a time when most doctors weren't specialists. Her parents had general practice, they delivered a lot of babies. My grandfather did some surgery, but doctors of my grandfather's era did just about any kind of medicine that anybody needed. There was no such thing as specialist. And when they were going to these various hospitals, when they were going to Greenville, going to Albion, and communicating with these other hospitals, they didn't tend to have specialists in that era. And my father was a surgeon, my mother was a pediatrician at the time. And so they're trying to find a town that would accept doctors that had a specialty. And Albion had a surgeon, had one surgeon before this who was about to retire. And
Dr. R. Sharp.
Yeah, Debbie's grandfather.
Your grandfather?
Yes, R. Sharp.
Wow. Well, let's throw the floor open to questions. Is there anything you'd like to know from Dr. Miriam?
What year was it you came to Albion?
What year did you come to Albion?
When did he come? 1955?
July 1955.
And I was here until about 5.5 years ago. when I moved to Chelsea. And I live in the Chelsea retirement community. And what's his name? Tom Brown, the minister, he lives in the same building. I see him quite frequently. And who's the school teacher?
Marilyn.
Marilyn Adams. Yes, is there. Grace Main, who used to live with me. She was my housekeeper.
Betty Bees.
Betty Pease is there. She lives in a different building, but I see her now and then, off and on.
In the late 1980s, my father took me aside and told me that he didn't expect Betty to live very long. And Betty Bees now
97.
is 97 years old. She's just 3 weeks younger than my mother. She doesn't see very well. She doesn't hear very well. She can't walk. She's in a wheelchair, but she has an amazingly positive attitude. And she showed him because he's been dead for 33 years.
Betty Pease was in the athletic department of Albion College, and she was in charge of the swimming pool and the aquatic center, and I think she taught canoeing and sailing and all that. Maybe some of you knew Betty Pease when she lived here.
She also worked on the ambulance, yeah.
Yes, she was in the ambulance.
First time I ever worked on an ambulance for Betty was my EMT.
But she's still alive. Her memory is not too good, but she's very healthy otherwise.
And by the way, Betty enjoys getting cards, although she can no longer read them. So what ends up happening is if she gets a card, when Nancy or I go over to visit her, we will read those cards to her, but they tend to accumulate. And so it might be a couple weeks after she receives the card that she'll get it read to her, but she does enjoy hearing from people. Even though she may not remember who you are, she appreciates getting the cards. Well, thank you. Let's call it at the end. But Mom will be around to visit with you, and thank you so much for coming. And if anybody wants a book that didn't get one, Jim still has some, and he'd be glad to sell you.